Hi everyone. The second video of this week, which is also of course the second lecture of this week, is going to be about discourse markers. You see an example on the screen there. Well, what have we got here? So these wells are examples of discourse markers. You can see a couple of examples of discourse markers on the screen that come from various different languages. Basically, discourse markers are small words that often occur in conversation. They tend to indicate abstract meanings that are usually difficult to put into words. So if you try to, maybe you can spend like 10 or 15 seconds, ask yourself, what do one of the words you see on the screen mean? It might be very difficult to define. But they are still very important. They act like glue. They glue different parts of the conversation together, and also they glue us together by helping us navigate interpersonal relationships. A lot of the time, people think that discourse markers are meaningless. You're from California, you probably had the experience where people tell you that the word like is bad, you shouldn't say it too much. Or fillers like and you might have been told that these are bad things, you shouldn't say them too much. This is one example I've pulled from Twitter. There is this person who is trying to make fun of Taylor Swift by pointing to her language, the fact that she uses the word well a lot of time. This is kind of like an ideology of referentialism. People think that words are not useful if they don't help you point to something in the real world, like a physical well. But, well, as I've just said, the word well is actually very, very meaningful. It typically tells us that what's going to come is going to be not quite what you expect. If you look at the quick example here, Mary says, because the engine was hot, because there wasn't enough water in the radiator. And then she said, I talked to Oscar about it, and he said, now pay attention. Well, I checked. It was only about, I'd say, half a quart to a quart short of water. But that shouldn't make any difference. Now, you can see that Mary was talking to Oscar about there not being enough water in the radiator. So what Oscar said is kind of unexpected to Mary. So that's why the word well is usually telling you this is probably not going to be what you expect. In general, discourse markers often tell us the relationship between previous and following parts of a discourse. It helps us respond to a previous context and project or tell us what to expect about the following context. This is another good example of a discourse marker. Good example, get it? Okay, never mind if you don't speak Spanish. But basically, the word bueno translates to good, but it often does not mean good when you look at natural conversation. Quite often, in fact, it indicates a slight change in topic. So you can see here, B says, ¿Y qué edad tiene hoy? And then A says, va a cumplir 13 años. Bueno, mañana es el cumpleaños de la Sandy, que cumple 19. Now, so A says she's going to be 13, and this 13 is the she in blue. She's a girl called Candace. But then when you look at line 115, you can see that she changes the topic to talk first about Sandy. She's actually going to come back to talk about Candace later, but 115, in the 115, the word bueno signaled a shift from talking about Candace to talking about Sandy. By the way, those curly lines that you see on the screen, we're not going to cover them too much in this course, but basically these mean that we are looking at linguistic expressions that point to the same person or the same thing. Well, now that we have talked a little bit about Spanish, let's try to go back to well, and actually let's also try to go back in another sense and integrate what we've learned on Monday with what we're going to learn on Wednesday. So the word well can be used as a floor-taking device, i.e. it can be used to start talking to signal to the other person that I want to be the one talking. So here, Jamie said the word well at an interjacent overlap. So you see it overlapped with the word in that Pete was saying. So this is a way for Jamie to basically interrupt Pete, you can think of it that way, and take the floor. So this shows us that discourse markers are often used for managing interaction. In particular, in this case, we see that it is being used to manage the floor. And now this is a final example from Mandarin. So you can look a little bit at the context here. F says they don't have to earn money at all, don't have to live at all, don't have to, that kind of thing. And then M says, nah. F says, don't they have real life considerations? And then M says, there will always be this kind of person occasionally, but that doesn't represent the majority of people. So if you remember, the parentheses with an ellipsis inside it means a long pause. And there's a long pause, a very long one, between 47 and 48. This coupled with the fact that 47, you can see that is the end of a sentence in terms of grammar. In terms of prosody, the period that you see there indicates that the intonation is falling. So all of these indicate that M had kind of finished what he was trying to say in 47. But then in 48, he affirms and says, yes, 对. So the word 对 literally means right, but here M is using it to basically say that, okay, this is all I wanted to say, it's your turn to speak. So apart from taking the floor, discourse markers can also be used to give up the floor. So if we wanted to be technical, we can call 对 a floor yielding device. Discourse markers and also interjections, those are quite closely related things. Those often occur at the start of a turn, which is a phenomenon we call prefacing. So basically, you start speaking with a discourse marker, and this discourse marker will then be responsive to the previous parts of the turn and then prepare you for the later, more substantive parts of the turn. So we have just seen that well is one type of marker that can do that. Now, if you look at what Alice is saying here, she says, because that 5-car pileup they had between Harden and Crow, so Alice is mentioning a new kind of event here. And then Mary says, oh shit, really? So the first O there, it indicates that Mary is only just now learning about this incident. And then the shit and really shows her surprise at the thing and shows her emotional reaction of, oh my gosh, this is so bad. So this prepares for the more substantive parts later on in the turn, which is I didn't hear about it, which elaborates on Mary's surprise. So this is one way that discourse markers are often used to begin a turn. So the previous discussion actually oriented us to some very important details about what we can do to show that a discourse marker has a certain function. So for example, we just mentioned that we can use a discourse marker to take the floor. If that is the case, we would expect that these discourse markers often appear at the beginning of a turn. In fact, we might expect that they appear even more often when there is interjacent overlap, because we are trying to show to the other person, hey, I am the person who wants to speak here. Whereas if some discourse marker is a floor yielding device, we would expect that it tends to go to the end of the turn. So where a discourse marker appears often is very, very indicative of its function in interaction. So we can look at the location of discourse markers with respect to different units, but the three most important ones that I will urge you to pay attention to are intonation units, acts or turn constructional units or utterances, and turns. So an intonation unit is basically a short burst of speech in the Santa Barbara corpus that we're looking at. That basically means one line of the conversation. If you don't have recordings for the data set you're working on, so for example, if you're working on Buddhist sutras, you can use punctuation marks as a reference, then you will get something that's very similar to intonation units, though not necessarily exactly in practice. The second structure would be the act or turn constructional unit or the utterance. These three are not exactly the same thing, but they all have very similar conceptual basis, which is basically it is a part of a turn that fully performs an action. So for example, if you say, hi, how are you doing? Then the hi, it performs the function of greeting, and how are you doing? It's also a greeting, but now you're moving a step forward. You're asking somebody else how they are doing. So you can think of hi and how are you doing as two different TCUs or utterances or acts. This is the first one, act, is a little bit unusual, but it's the one that is being used in your reading. In some other books, you might see terms like dialogue acts, so that will be used more in artificial intelligence, computer science context. You might also see the term speech act, which is used heavily in philosophy and also in some traditions of linguistics. So for example, some corpus linguists in the UK will talk about speech acts. The final structure that we can place discourse markers in would be the turn, which we've been talking about a lot. So the locations of discourse markers, as we've just said in the previous slide, are very important. One thing that you will often notice when you are working on your projects is that discourse markers tend to appear at the edges of structures. For example, at the start of a turn, they have a prefacing function, they may have a floor-taking function. At the start of a TCU or act, they can connect the previous TCU to the current TCU. And then at the end of a turn, it helps you give up the floor and so on. And if you look at IUs, you will see a very similar pattern where discourse markers will tend to appear at the edge. So for example, I didn't put this on the slide, but if you have a filler like or those very likely appear at the end of an intonation unit, because an end of an intonation unit is when you really need to signal to the other person that this is not the last intonation unit I'm going to be producing. So fillers like and they are very, very useful for having a floor holding function. That means telling the other person that I'm not done speaking yet. So your Fuentes Rodriguez reading is going to describe the meaning of the word pues by dividing them first into locations and then specific functions. So this idea of discourse markers appearing in specific places inside these units is a very, very important concept that I hope all of you are going to grasp while you are reading the reading.